into open session, there's sometimes an item on an agenda that says motions coming out of the camera. And there may be a motion that says to approve CAO's contract or to extend the CAO's contract by a year. Something to that effect. So the motion would be made in public, even though the conversation would happen in private. Does that help? Okay. So that's fairly new, saying that you actually have to have the reference of the FOIP Act on the agenda. And you can't, we've been involved in code of conduct reviews where topics, somebody goes into the camera for one reason, but really is to talk about something else. And when we find out about that, there's a real problem with that when that happens too. So that's the piece on closed session. On disqualification. So you only hold office as long as you are eligible for nomination. So if you become ineligible for nomination while you are holding office, you are considered to be disqualified from that office and you would be asked to resign from council. If you choose not to be resigned from council, if you choose not to resign from council yourself, somebody will ask a judge to do it for you. And that's what happened to this poor Village of Riley councillor earlier this year. He owed some money to the town. They were having a disagreement about, I think it was utilities or something to that effect. But he owed more than the maximum allowable amount to the village as a councillor. Council sanctioned him, he rejected it. A judge came back and said, no, you're beyond the realm of acceptable, of being eligible for nomination, your seat is vacant. So the judge actually removed him from office. So these are some of the reasons that you would consider to be ineligible. So the common issues for disqualification are if you're not eligible to be elected, which kind of is the other stuff to be considered. So a big one to that, if you're not eligible to be elected, is that you don't live in town anymore. We have run across that sometimes. We did a municipal inspection in the town of Athabasca, where one member of council, it was rumored, lived in St. Albert, as it turned out. People attested to this. However, we found, and it was supported by the minister, that actually his driver's license had an Athabasca address, so he was good. It's a bit of a nuance, but so if you don't live in town, you're not eligible to serve on council, your seat would be considered vacant. Other things in here, if you missed 8 consecutive weeks of council meetings without an absence. So if you got sick or something and were ended up in the hospital, or you ended up in the United States, the borders got closed, you couldn't get back, you would probably have an excused absence. But if you just chose not to show up to council meetings for those 8 consecutive weeks, you would have your seat considered, you would be disqualified and you would be asked to resign. This tends to be a bit of a problem for small communities in summer, because it's not uncommon that may only be 2 meetings, that you may only have 1 meeting a month. If you miss 8 weeks in 2 months, that may only be 2 meetings, so it can be a bit of a problem, unexcused absences. If you are convicted of something that carries a prison sentence of 5 years or more, you are considered to be disqualified. And that kind of makes sense to me. The other piece to that is, if you are in prison for 5 years or more, you're more than likely going to miss 8 consecutive weeks of council meetings. My suspicion is those would not be excused absences. If you don't vote when you're supposed to, voting is absolutely mandatory. The only reason you don't vote is if you can't vote. And there are really only a couple of reasons that you can't vote. One is that you have this pecuniary interest, you have monetary benefit in whatever the council is going to decide potentially. And the other is that you missed part or all of a public hearing on something that you may be asked to vote on. Since you missed the inputs, you can't vote on it. But other than that, you absolutely have to vote. There's no such thing as perceived or possible or potential conflict of interest. It either is or it isn't. And if you don't know, the advice is to get a legal opinion before the vote. Because if you don't vote when you're supposed to, you don't have an opinion as an elected official, your seat would be considered vacant. And that gets to pecuniary interest, which I just mentioned. If you have a liability to the municipality over a certain amount, this is that reference to the Riley thing, you were considered to be ineligible. Typically, that is like a year's property taxes that you would vote. And finally, if you vote for inappropriate expenditures. So there's something called a debt limit. And that means the municipality can't borrow more than 1.5 times its annual operating revenue. So you may want to borrow money for road upgrades, for arena refits, or something like that. As long as you stay below that 1.5 times, you're fine. If you vote on an expenditure that takes you over that debt limit, that's what we would call an inappropriate expenditure. The other problem, the other place that's a problem, is if you receive a grant, say from an order of government to fix the HVAC system on the arena, but you really spend it on Main Street beautification, that's considered to be an inappropriate expenditure too, and that will be cause for disqualification. So this list of stuff actually shows up in the Act. The final note here is that only the judge can remove a city council member who chooses not to resign. It happens very rarely, which is why I posted this news up here. This is the first one I can recall in quite a long time. So if you want to avoid some of the pitfalls that you've got coming for you, this is the happy place. This is where you start to build your virtuous cycle. If you are encouraging each other to be the best that you can be, that really helps. If you're not dragging each other down into the depths of despair, pits of unhappiness, that really helps as well. Know that council has to be each other's first team. You need to rely on each other. Because you know more about your community, for better and for worse, you have to rely on each other, or else it's a really lonely existence. I've got a note here about culture. I mentioned the culture about long or short council meetings. Some municipalities in Alberta, and if you look at local government, you probably know where I mean. Some municipalities just have a reputation as asking meetings. But no matter what they do, they don't seem to be able to drag themselves back onto the good side of the ledger, if you know. And in another way, there are those municipalities which have a really good perspective going. I'll give you a couple of examples. I don't want to give you the others. I'll give you the examples of those who I've really seen in these centuries who kind of mid-sized municipalities. So places like Beaumont or Okotoks have really been punching above their weight class. And a lot of that has to do, I think anyway, with the team atmosphere. The council believes it's greater than the sum of parts. And that builds that virtuous cycle, and that encourages that for anybody who's involved in municipality. The last piece on here is about your own values and your own ethics being important. So there are some sayings in there too about is good just an absence of bad, or is it not? Just because something's legal doesn't mean you should do it. So some of those things that you need to think about yourselves, and you need to challenge other members of your council team as well. If you think about where you begin, this me in this case, I realize this is starting with me, and I don't mean myself because I'm not putting my name. I did put my name on the ballot once. Now I do this. It didn't work out very well for me. Anyway, so you need to have your family supports in place. You need to have your family on side with you to understand that this job you're looking for is irregular. It's really hard to hold down a council, seat as well as work full-time on a strict 9 to 5, Monday to Friday job. Because the meetings that you go to, whether they're in the community or beyond, tend to be really irregular in how they occur. I mentioned the business principle here about keeping things public unless there's a reason not to, versus keeping things private unless you absolutely have to release them. And finally, a note about the spirit of the law here. There are lots of people, whenever we do a council violation review or a municipal inspection, somebody's always just picking on a little bit of one act or one regulation or one phrase or one bylaw that's just trying to justify what they've already decided they want to do. And that to me is really just looking for an excuse to get around the spirit of the law and just follow the absolute letter of the law. Those of you who are virtuous probably have no issue with this. Those of you who are trying to find a way to do something, nobody here. But those of the others who are trying to do things that they ought not to be doing can probably find some loophole somewhere that hadn't been intended. In terms of workload, it's what you make it. I made a reference earlier about Lethbridge, and I said, according to the Act, all you really have to do is show up to meetings, council meetings and committee meetings. And some municipalities don't use a lot of committees. So that's the mandatory stuff that you got to do. From there, you start adding on, and that's the voluntary piece. A good local elected official has a good handle on the heartbeat of their community. They're showing up at graduations. They're going to the chicken dinners or the burger suppers or the 4-H showings or those sort of things. Because that's where they learn what's going on in their community. So that they can make those informed decisions in those council and committee meetings. Really, for most people who end up in elected office, it's just a continuation of the stuff that they used to do before, except now they go to these council meetings, and rather than sit in the gallery, they actually pay to go to these council meetings for a change, which is kind of a bit of a nice change. So you attend these community events, maybe you're cutting ribbons, maybe you're making speeches at high school graduations, those sort of things. You're engaging, physically engaging with people, being where they are, metaphorically being where they are, talking to them, putting out newsletters, being a good communicator, letting them know what's going on with their municipality, and asking them what's important to them for their municipality as well. Because fundamentally, we all chose to live in the same place for the same reason. We do make reference here to the family too. You need your family's support. Your hours again are so weird that you're going to be away at conferences, you've got late night meetings, you probably have to get up early to drive someplace. But you need that family backbone to help you out as well. You mentioned noting here about evenings and weekends and travel that you've got to do. Some of these highways in the middle of winter aren't that great anywhere, and you never really know what's going to pop out of the dark as you read it. So you really need your family to be outside, and if they're not, it could be a real long waiting for 4 years. I want to kind of come to a bit of a close here in terms of what you can expect. So once you've gotten elected, one of the things we found actually in my own community, we got a brand new mayor for 3 years and 8 months ago now. One of the things that surprised him most was the day after the election, he was the mayor. He had thought that there was going to be this transitionary period, like they do federally or provincially, that was a swearing in a few weeks later. No, he was on the job kind of the next day. Here's all your briefing binders, Mr. Mayor. People are calling him by this honorific, when he used to just be live. Some people like honorific, some people don't. I have a colleague by the name of George Cuff, some of you probably know. And he's written a ton of books on local government and worked all over the place. One of the things he taught me early on is elected officials, as soon as you're elected, you lose your first name. And I believe, my belief is that you have earned the title by virtue of representing your community of mayor, of reeve, of councillor. So I will always defer to those titles out of respect. It's pretty common, however, that in a casual situation, they'll say, just call me Rob. And I'm more than happy to do that, but I believe in respecting the role that you take on. Anyway, in your first 30 days, as you come in, so 19th, 20th of October, you're now mayor, you're now councillor. You wouldn't be reeve yet because that hasn't come to pass. These are the things you'll do. You'll start to meet people. There's two processes that are happening. You're being onboarded, you're being told, or you're being given a set of keys and some binders, you're told where the washrooms are and that sort of thing, and then you're being oriented. You'll go through a formal orientation. And that typically happens within 2 to 4 weeks following the election. It's a full day session on tonight plus. So tonight's kind of light, considering some of the things that we do during orientations. For those of you who are those of you who are Kneehill County, so you'll get that sort of thing happening. You'll begin to understand the different types of meetings, your first council meetings. You'll get to an organizational meeting where the reeve will be chosen with your rural, where you start to get some of your committee, where you'll get your committee assignments, begin to understand kind of what the job is. You'll start to get through that meeting cycle, and you'll go through kind of these sorts of things. In the first 90 days or the first quarter, these are some of the things that you're likely to find. These are called urban and rural municipalities both have their conference typically in the first quarter after an election. Some meet once, some have a conference once a year, some have a conference twice a year. So you may be going to those. One of the things that kind of irks me a little bit about the way the system is set up is you come into office in October. The fiscal year for municipality runs January to December. So you come into office and have to start working on a budget for next year before you even know what the job is. And that can be a really difficult thing to do. If you don't understand budgets, if you aren't aware of how municipal finance works. Now, some municipalities will do what's called an interim budget, which is pass a small budget until we get back to the big one earlier in the year. But you'll have to be doing budget, and that will include things like assessments, it'll include taxes, all the programs that you're having to do. Plus, if you look at those 4 buckets of what council has to do, how do you start getting your priorities into that first budget? You got like 6 weeks between when you take office and when the budget happens. There's really tough to do. So I'm often a proponent of pushing strategic plans forward a year. So you will adopt the last council strategic plan for a year, as you'll learn the ropes, and then you'll pass your strategic plan on to the next council for a year as well for the same reason. So you'll get into tax rates, you begin a quarterly financial review. I'll say too that in terms of governance finance, you're not looking at the check register. You're not looking at the accounts payable, accounts receivable. You're not looking at the bank statement. Your job in terms of governance finance is how are we doing as opposed to what we expected to do. So variance from budget, positive or negative variance. Because council gave permission to administration to spend this amount of money in these areas. From a governance perspective, should be thinking about, are we on track, are we off track to spend in those areas, above or below, rather than who you write a check to. To me, that's one of those things that lengthens your council meetings unnecessarily. Starting on your strategic plan. Well, typically when we do strategic planning, we'll start in the spring. So I mentioned that Saskatchewan is a year ahead of us. We've done 3 strategic plans in Saskatchewan in the last 6 months because now they're starting to get their feet under them. And then this is the Kneehill Partnership. You would probably meet colleagues. I find it's really useful for municipal governments to meet each other before you have things to argue about. So if you can come together and learn from one another, figure out who each other are as people, maybe that gives you a little bit more grace and a little bit more patience when there are problems that you tend to come up and you're not immediately across the table from one another. If you look at your first full year, it's a cycle of everything. You're going to go through all the financial stuff. You're going to have to do that review of the CAO. Oftentimes, those CAO reviews would be done on an anniversary, a hiring anniversary, give or take a little bit. So it's not that they all just happen in March or they all just happen in August. They can happen anytime throughout the year. So that review would happen at that point. My encouragement to you would be to take advantage of those professional development opportunities. Even though you got elected because you got more votes than I did, you have the opportunity to take on some professional development that I don't. So you can begin to become an expert in the job. Either because you're a raw rookie and want to learn it the first time through, or maybe there's some nuance for you as the person who's now got 4 or 8 years under your belt. I know when we do these orientations in October, it's like feeding you from the fire hose. So we talk about the role of elected officials, the role of administration, all that stuff. I have no idea how much of it elected officials remember, but I mentioned this thing in Stratford, Ontario, where ongoing grid type professional development is another way to consider it, just do a little bit at a time. I know one municipality we work with brought in a parliamentarian, a registered parliamentarian once a year, just to remind council about how it ought to work, how parliamentary procedure works. Because for most people, it's a brand new game. They don't really understand motions and the triggers. And somebody who understands that procedure has an advantage over somebody who doesn't. Looking back on your strategic plan, how did we do last year? What are we planning for next year? Probably resetting your priorities. No strategy survives first contact with reality, but you're going to do the best you can to plan. And so you're going to look at your priorities based on the resources that you've got available to you. We're going to know here about the annual financial review. Every municipality has to go through an audit every year. I said that you, as elected officials, will appoint your auditor. You will receive the audit report, and you will have to digest it to determine whether money was spent as you had expected, and whether your auditor has any suggestions on how to improve things for next year. And finally, there's a report to the community. Some of you may do things like a state of the town, a state of the county address. Some of you may put out an annual report. Some of you may just put on a workshop in a variety, or an open house or something in a variety of community halls and say, come have whatever donuts Mike has to eat, and enjoy the evening, and come talk to us, we'll talk to you a little bit more. Right? So those are the sort of things that you can expect. I wanted to provide you with a couple of resources. One of these is the other handout that you've got. So it's got that kind of first 30 days of things that you can take into account. The backside of that handout has some decision-making principles, again, that his colleague of mine, George Huff, developed. I use them with his permission. And it's how to make good decisions as a local government. This, I suspect, may be available electronically. I recognize if you're looking at URLs written out, it's not a whole lot of help to you. But these are some resources in terms of websites that can be useful to you. Some things like the Municipal Government Act or the 3 pieces of legislation I talked about right at the very top. If you want to have a look at them, you can. When I made reference to the Municipal Government Act, for you as elected officials, you're only looking at 10, 20% of it. You're not looking at all 700 pages, unless you're really interested in it, in which case, other acts are there too. Most municipalities will have their bylaws and policies on their websites. Some will provide them to you as part of an election package, a nomination package. They are all public documents, so even if they're not on the website, you can ask for them and you will get them. You might be interested in looking at what happens in one community's documents versus another to see where the nuances between Three Hills and between Kneehill County might be, where there's, can we learn from each other? Somebody said to me the other day, plagiarism saves time. So if you're going to take bylaws from somebody else, there's a lot of copying that happens. We actually did for the government of Northwest Territories, we did a choose your own adventure bylaw for meeting procedure where we filled out gave them the framework. We said, gave them a series of blanks and said, what fits best for your community, and here's what works for you. So rather than them having to just steal from their neighboring municipality, they got the chance to create their own adventure bylaw. And that was fun. So the other pieces there are budgets, annual reports, annual reviews, all those financial things are public as well. Here are some organizations that you might be interested in. The two primary ones are the Rural Municipalities in Alberta, which is the Rural Association, and the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, or AUMA. Also here is the LGAA, the Local Government Administrators Association, that your CAO will probably belong to. It has some resources that you might find interesting too. FCM, or the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, is the National Association of Municipalities for Canada. They have a lot of resources on their website, both for administrators, but more so for elected officials. And finally, the Elected Officials Education Program, or EOEP, is offered jointly by AUMA and RNA. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a way for you to learn on the job what the job actually entails. Augustana campus of the University of Alberta does some programming as well. And then people like me programming too. So those are some of the things. I put some, because I like reading, I thought you might as well. I put some references to reading material on here that you might find fun. The first and foremost, of course, is my own work, which we just published last year. I'm actually working on the second book at the moment too. I'm working on the 25 attributes of well-functioning mayors. And I had a really interesting conversation with the mayor of Regina last week. Her name's Sandra Masters, and she had never served in elected office before November of last year. She just got elected as the mayor of Regina, but beat an incumbent while she was doing it. So I was fascinated to get a chance to talk to her. But I talked to village mayors. I was talking to some folks in Australia last night, the principles of governance and principles of governance. Anyway, my book's there. George Cuff has a whole series of books on good local government. He's from out of Spruce Grove. So a lot of his stuff is local to you as well. Sometimes his nickname is Gruff Cuff, so he can be a little bit of a polarizing influence, but he's really good at what he does. On the further right, there's Municipal World Magazine. It's a monthly magazine, obviously. Most, if not all of your municipalities will probably subscribe to this, and it has some really good information in it too. The lower left is Boards That Make a Difference. It's an old book from 1990 or so by John Carver. It talks about the Carver model of board governance, and a lot of what happens in local government is around that. In the middle is, what's this one called? The Nurturing Ethics in Governance. I like the subtitle on this one. Taming Our Rascals Within. It was published last year by a fellow in Edmonton about exactly what it sounds like about ethics in local government. And then just for fun, the last one is called Mayors Gone Bad. It's a Canadian book about mayors who are doing things they ought not to have been doing, and have got caught doing them, and some of them ended up behind bars. You won't be surprised, a lot of them came from the Montreal area. One of them may have been named Ford. And then, so it's not that new, but to me anyway, it's a fun read. So there's a lot of information here about local government. I just wanted to wrap up here and say that most of what we talked about, almost all of what we talked about, dealt with what happens on October 20th and beyond. Didn't barely, if at all, touched on the election process itself. But I don't know if any of you know a guy by the name of Nolan Krause. He's a former mayor of St. Albert and just released a book within the last few weeks. If you look at nolankrauseauthor.ca or .com, he just wrote a book on running for office. I haven't actually looked at it yet, but I have talked to him about it, and he knows what he's talking about. So here, knowing that what you must do, what you should do, what you should not do, I mean, fundamentally, if you're in this for the right reason, the rules, the golden rule applies to much of this stuff. If you're trying to find a way around circumventing the rules, you're probably not doing it for the right reason. So anyway, I think, yeah, that's where I wanted to leave off. And I know we had you for a couple hours, but I wanted to give you an opportunity too to see if any of you had, whether you had disagreements with what I said, whether you had questions about what I said. You can either ask them here, or I'll stick around until everybody else is on as well. If anybody has anything. If not, I will just let you hold the mic, I guess. Okay, well, I missed. Mike, did you need to say anything? You're good. All right, I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to respond. I understand this is, while it's being live streamed, will also be put up on, will be available probably on the county's website and maybe other websites as well. You've got the slides there too, and my contact information is on this last page. I tell people that one of my company's values is wisdom. And it talks about sharing what we've learned. If you have questions that you don't want to ask tonight, or that you think about sometime tomorrow or the next day, give me a call or send me an email, and I'm more than happy just to help you out with that. I think good governance done well is worth a lot, and I want to do my part to help you further that. So thanks so much. You've been sitting here quite gracefully and patiently now for almost 2 hours. I could talk about this all day. I probably should. But I want to say thank you so much for coming out. This is the largest group I've had a chance to speak to in a year and a half. So thank you so much, and enjoy the evening. Hope you make some great decisions over the next few months. Whatever happens, I'm sure you'll remain in service of your community. So thank you, good night.